Nothing on the Bunnell Foundation's Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast should be considered medical advice. Medical advice can only come from your CF physician. Cystic fibrosis can be a devastating diagnosis, but living with the disease can bring positivity and a new appreciation for each day. From the Bunnell Foundation in Detroit, Michigan, it's the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast, sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical. Here's your host, Laura Bunnell.
Representative Mike Mueller and his sister Madeline Elmhirst are talking with us today. Representative Mueller is responsible for the 51st House District, which is part of Genesee and Oakland County. And I met him at the state capitol, I think it was May of 2018. It was with Representative Jim Ellison when Jim introduced a resolution to declare May as CF Awareness Month. Representative Mueller said that his sister has cystic fibrosis, and he has co-sponsored the resolution ever since. And as you'll hear, Representative Mueller started out in law enforcement, and his older sister Madeline, who has CF, has a career as a musician, playing the saxophone and singing. Of course, the lives of this brother and sister cross over in many ways, and that's today's podcast about how they support each other through a life with CF. Thanks for joining us, Representative Mike Mueller and his sister, Madeline Elmhirst. Thank you both for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Laura. It's great to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you here. Glad to meet you officially on Zoom. First, I wanted to start with you, Representative Mueller. It's wonderful that you get this. It's wonderful to have somebody on board who understands pretty much everything we're talking about when we talk about cystic fibrosis. Other people are willing to learn, and that's wonderful as well. But there is something different when you just get it because you've lived it. So we first met in Lansing at the Capitol on the floor when you came over to introduce yourself after Representative Jim Ellison made the resolution to make May CF Awareness Month, which he's been doing every year for a while. And now you've joined him in that. And then to meet you and realize that your sister had cystic fibrosis, I was so excited. I know that's a strange thing. I don't wish this disease on anyone, but it was great to connect with you. So thanks for being part of our CF community.
No problem. It was nice meeting you too. And Jim's a good guy. So you got lucky with him as well.
We did. And I have to say, I love that you're a Republican and that he's a Democrat and we're all working together as it should be. I love that. It's so important. And I love everyone's different views. It's crucial, critical to everything that we do. First of all, why don't we start with when you realized that your sister had cystic fibrosis and kind of how that changed your life or maybe steered your life from the beginning?
Well, my sister's, 4 years older than I am. So she was diagnosed, I believe, right when my mom was pregnant with me. So I would have had to been a few years old, but it was just routine. She was older than I was. So when I was born and, we just grew up with her, my parents having to give her therapy every day, a couple times a day. And, we had a lot of trips to the hospital when I was young down to U of M. And I remember on our way back from Florida one time, we had to stop at the Ronald McDonald House because she had gotten sick. So it's just something that, when your older sister has it and you're born into it, you don't know anything really any different. And so, you'd have friends come over and they would wonder what was going on. And you just have to explain to them that, she has cystic fibrosis. It's a genetic, lung disorder. And you just explain things to your friends, then they get it. But then over the years with the, technology with medical equipment, the manual therapy went away, and then you'd have to listen to a big old machine that was, doing, the therapy for her. And, just a lot of medicine and things that I would see her take. And I was just, I was thinking, wow, I'm lucky that I didn't have it because I had to see what she had to go through, her whole life, all the medicine that she had to take.
And that's what I was going to ask you. Did it make you feel like, I don't know, was there any jealousy or was there any resentment toward this disease?
No, because my sister always, and my parents, specifically my mom, always did a good job with everything. And Madeline was really active. Even when she had CF, she's very musical and was a really good student. I was the guy that played sports, and she was the one that excelled in academics. So we both had our own niche. But, she, like I said, she played the saxophone as well. She was in the marching band. She always kept active. So you would never know she had cystic fibrosis by the stuff that she did. You'd only know, behind the scenes kind of, when she would have to go in the hospital for certain things. Like some people get sick, they just stay at home. But with her, she would have to go in the hospital at times. So, you spend quite a bit of time in the hospital, especially when we were younger.
And we're going to get to Madeline in a second as she patiently waits. But you started out in law enforcement. Now you're in Congress. Do you think that this knowledge of a rare disease of cystic fibrosis has helped you what you're doing now as a legislator?
Well, just, the thing is I have understanding of it. I mean, you have 110, representatives, and we all come from different backgrounds. That's what makes, it's legislature unique. You can't be an expert in all the fields, but, when you can tell a personal story, when you're trying to form legislation, it always has a bigger effect, and it carries a little bit more weight and credibility because you can relate to it on a personal level. So, the law enforcement is really what helped me out, is because, you have to look at both sides of the story when you go to a call. And it's just the same way with legislation. You have to look at both sides of the argument on certain legislation, and you try to figure out a compromise. And that's what I did in law enforcement. But when it comes to having a sister with cystic fibrosis, it just, I can give that personal story. And, and my story is a lot better than a lot of people. My sister's 50 years old. She had a double lung transplant. And, when she was younger, a lot of kids were dying young. And so, I've been fortunate enough to have her around for 50 years. And, she moved away, right after high school. She went to Northwestern and then moved out to Colorado and hasn't been back since to live, but she does come to visit. But it's always good to see her. And I'm just, I'm very fortunate that I'm able to have a sister with CF that's lived as long as she has and lived a pretty healthy lifestyle.
Because my daughters are 23 and 26 and both have CF, and their life expectancy was 17 years old. So Madeline, your life expectancy, you've long outlived that, right?
Yes, I really have. And I'm of an age where my actual age has really matched the life expectancy. As progress has been made in treating cystic fibrosis and patient care has gotten better and people are living longer, I kind of ridden right along the crest, maybe just a little ahead. And, that's been kind of a really fascinating experience.
So take us back to when you remember that you knew that you had cystic fibrosis and maybe what that meant.
So I was diagnosed when I was 4, and I was really lucky as a kid. I didn't present as typical. So in 1970, when I was born, kids with CF usually were diagnosed with failure to thrive. As babies, they just didn't gain weight, and that would be the first indication that maybe something was wrong. But I was a really normal weight as a kid. But I did have some respiratory infections. My mom thought maybe it was allergies because my dad has bad hay fever. And we ended up at an allergist who had done a residency at the University of Michigan and had seen kids with CF. And they said, she doesn't present as CF, but I'm not going to screen her for allergies until she's had a sweat test, which is still the standard by which you diagnose cystic fibrosis. They measure how much salt is in your sweat. So they took me to the U of M, and I failed the sweat test several times. So I was 4. And at that time, the only thing they had to treat CF were some digestive enzymes and the physical therapy, chest physiotherapy. So they taught my mom how to do the chest physiotherapy and sent me home with a prescription for digestive enzymes. And that's how we got along, for many, many years. So for me, it goes back, my cystic fibrosis goes back as far as I can remember. I think my early memories are probably what everybody told me, about my diagnosis in the early years. I do have early memories of laying on the therapy table. We often listened to records while mom did therapy. It took 30 minutes, twice a day. I remember how those pills at the time, they were really primitive, how they tasted and how they smelled, which was terrible. I remember our visits to the pediatrician in Ann Arbor. Mom would make a day of it. We often went to the Natural History Museum to look at the dinosaur bones. I really liked that, or had a fancy meal out. So for me, most of the memories were this is what we do. And for the most part, it didn't interfere with what I perceived as normal childhood. I still played outside. I had friends. I went to school. I did most of the normal kid things. And so there were instances where life got interrupted because of a serious illness that required hospitalization. But really, they were clustered. I was in the hospital for most of fourth grade, and I have quite a few memories of that. And then after that, I was hospitalized once in high school and did really well until I went to college and went through another series of hospitalizations during that time. But, it has always been part of my life. And the burden of care is really high. But I think I learned really young that the maintenance, what you do to stay healthy pays off. If I do my therapy and take my medications, then my life the rest of the time is pretty normal and pretty great.
And I wanted to ask you the same question because my girls have always said, we're so glad we both have it because we both get it and they can talk to each other about anything. But did you feel like, why doesn't Mike have CF or anything like that? Or was that not even in your mind?
It really wasn't in my mind. I guess I felt really lucky that he didn't have CF because I wouldn't want him to have to go through all of that medical treatment. And although my case, I'm one of the older ones, one of the lucky ones, I guess. Most of my friends from that era have died. And even today, young people with CF get sick and suffer quite a lot. And so I'm really glad that he didn't have to go through that and was able to not have to deal with those things.
And Representative Mueller, is there a biggest fear that you have for your sister? Are you always thinking about the what if or when as far as CF and Madeline goes?
Well, of course, you always wonder. Every time I hear that she's in the hospital, you're always concerned, especially, now during this pandemic issue. And she just, had her double lung transplant. So, you always worry. But Madeline is Madeline, and she just, she's not going to let things, slow her down. That's just her type of personality. But of course, as a, younger brother, you always worry about it. She was in the hospital. Shoot, for, I think it was 6 to 7 months. Because I remember it was when I first got elected, the first election in November of 18, I believe. She was going to come out for, the watch party, but she called and said, I have to go in the hospital. My lungs are pretty much done and I'm on the transplant list. And I'm like, okay. And she did come to visit me after I was elected, and we came down to the House floor right after she was able to, which was nice to have her there. But yeah, you always wonder. It's your sister, family member. And when she goes to the hospital for something, it's not like normal. You always have that fear that, if she gets pneumonia, she could die. She gets COVID, she could die. And so I'm just glad that she's been able to live pretty healthy for her entire life. She probably has a better grip on it than I do. So she just kind of goes with the flow and is a realistic person and understands that, you can't live your life in fear. You need to, have fun and just take the proper precautions. She drove out here from Minneapolis instead of flying. She does what she needs to do to keep herself healthy and safe. But she also doesn't let, it get her down.
And I love that. Your parents must love that you're still close and you stick together and all of that, I would think. And Madeline, you can answer that too, but I wanted to ask you, so a CF modulator comes out kind of just before your transplant, it sounds. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes. The modulator is so exciting. When somebody my age with cystic fibrosis knows that it's really likely in your future, you may face a double lung transplant. I was aware of that, from the time I was 20, maybe even younger. And I was hoping that the modulator therapy would be in time. I was hoping I would not need a transplant until after the age of 50 in my head. That was a goal. And I was able to be part of the clinical studies for one of the first modulators. For one of the very first modulators, I was in the clinical trial. It was kind of a phase 2B, and it was incredible. My lung function changed dramatically, and we were all very excited, but it was only a 4-week trial. And so I was set up to be part of the phase 3 clinical trials, which often allow you to stay on the drug for an extended period of time. And at the time, things just didn't work out, and I was excluded from that trial, and I was very sad. And at that point, that's where my decline towards transplant really accelerated. So that was about 5 years before my transplant happened. And I was able to take 2 of the early modulators prior to transplant, and they may have helped delay my transplant. I did not get the fantastic results I'd gotten during the study, but I'm just so excited for everyone else with cystic fibrosis who's pre-transplant who will have access to these drugs, because my study experience was so phenomenal, and it's going to change cystic fibrosis.
Absolutely. So briefly take us through when, how low your FEV1 was, how low that got your pulmonary function, and kind of what spurred on that you needed a double lung transplant.
So we monitor the pulmonary functions very closely. And I found at about the time that my FEV1 dropped below 60%, things got much harder. And for some reason, talking with my doctor, that was about the time where I asked them to evaluate me for supplemental oxygen. And they said, oh, no, that's much too high. We have people in the 30s and 20s who don't even need oxygen. But I had a pulmonary embolism at some point due to some medical treatment. And we think maybe some of the vasculature in my lungs was damaged because we did an evaluation. And when my FEV1 was right around 50%, I started to need supplemental oxygen with activity. So if I wanted to exercise, or if I was doing a lot of walking or physical activity, I needed the supplemental oxygen. And so I started on oxygen therapy very early in the process compared to most people. And I used that to kind of monitor my progress. So, months would go by and I would need a little bit more oxygen to do the same amount of activity. And exercise is really important. So I go into a workout and it's like, no, I needed to turn it up. And so I would continually talk to my doctors about this, and we would manage it with the help of some respiratory therapists at pulmonary rehab to track my oxygen needs. And eventually I got to a point, I was still at about 30 to 35% on an FEV1, which is the point where a lot of doctors start talking about lung transplantation. And I was needing just a lot of supplemental oxygen, and my heart rate was going very, very high with exercise. And so my doctors weren't sure that it was time, but over the course of several months, we said, let's just do the evaluation and see. And the evaluation came back, saying I was kind of right in the spot where most people are listed. And so my FEV1 was a little higher than average for people with cystic fibrosis. It's not the only criterion for lung transplants. So when they looked at all of the other functions, it's extensive testing that they do. I was at a point where it's time to be listed. So we went through that process. Once I was admitted, so I got an exacerbation. I thought I was going to go to the hospital for a few days, get started on IV drugs, go home and finish my therapy and wait at home while I was listed for lung transplant. I went to the hospital and a series of events happened. And although after a month of hospitalization, they sent me home for a weekend, and they wanted to have me come back and just make sure. And I had my numbers just got really bad, really fast. So I was back in the hospital and I stayed there until transplant. My FEV1 continued to decline, but we stopped testing at a certain point because it just didn't matter. I had other bigger issues. So we stopped doing pulmonary functions. My FEV1 was in the 20s. So then that was 3 months before my transplant. We actually don't know what it would have measured, but at a certain point, the readings aren't great anyway. When you get that low, it's really hard to perform the test. And so we just figured there was no point in doing it. So I don't actually know what my FEV1 was the day I was transplanted.
So you have the transplant, your husband's by your side, and 2 years later, how is life so different from your transplant day or pre-transplant?
It's pretty amazing. I feel like it's taken my lungs back to where they were when I was in my 30s. So after transplant, I kind of had a slow start. Each transplant is a little different, and my lung function didn't pop right back up. A lot of people will experience 100% expected value within a few months of transplant. When I left the hospital, I was still on oxygen. And over the course of the year, my lung function gradually improved. And it's in the 60 to 70% of what would be expected for somebody my age. That means that I can do almost everything. So sitting here talking with you, I feel fantastic. I don't have any shortness of breath. Some of the heavier, if I'm doing really heavy exercise, I'll notice. I'm a musician. I was hoping to have a little more volume for playing my saxophone and for singing than I do, but I'm learning to deal with what I have, which is so much more than I had pre-transplant, right? So the recovery takes a long time, even compared to, they said it will be a year. And at a year, I felt pretty good. But 2 years, I feel even better. But I have continued to work really hard. I know that the recovery period is a year, but I actually still think of myself I'm still recovering physical ability. I'm still getting stronger than I was before my transplant. It's slow. I'm 50, but I'm stronger now than I was 3 months ago. And I think there's still room. I think I'm going to be stronger 6 months from now than I was. And I intend to, work at that.
That's fantastic. And Representative Mueller, like in May, when you are now part of this resolution to make May CF Awareness Month, I really do think of you like cheering, like as my new hero. I am so excited that you get to do this in May and be a part of this. I mean, partly for your sister and then the rest of the people with CF. So what do you think when that month comes up and you're part of that resolution?
Well, I mean, it's pretty cool, just because, when you walk into that building and you're on the floor, it's just a pretty awing experience. And then to, be part of something that, like I said, I can relate to because of my sister, it's a good feeling. It's, a lot of the stuff that you do with resolutions and this type of thing are just to build awareness. And then when you are a representative, you have that platform to reach out to people. And then when you can share your personal experience, it makes things, like you said, more real for people when you can actually sit down and say, hey, listen, my sister has cystic fibrosis. I know what she has to go through with, the medical stuff and also being on health policy with, some of the bills that we have passed for, medical transparency and this type of thing. I'd be texting her during some of the committee hearings, and saying, hey, how do you guys do it up in Minneapolis? Because, we're changing things here in Michigan. And, I'm trying to get, again, every stakeholder has their views, because they're an industry, right? But in the end,
right,
we want to make sure that the people in the communities, our constituents and the normal people are the ones that get the relief that they need. It's a neat experience. And, I'm glad I'm able to share it with other legislators as well, because they have met Madeline too, because like I said, she's came to the floor. So they've met her too. So, once you meet somebody who has it, and then you have somebody like me that's there that can relate to it, it just makes things a lot better.
That is fantastic. And what do you think is the most important thing maybe that we can do for healthcare as a state or as a country, especially now that maybe more people get it because they've been impacted by COVID?
I've come to learn that it's very convoluted. There's so many working parts and so many different, you change one thing, it has an effect on this industry. You change another thing, it has an effect on that industry. It's almost like they designed it so convoluted on purpose so then people wouldn't understand it, right? So I think we just need to, the first and foremost, just have a lot more transparency when it comes to the medical field and prescription cost and medical cost and the cost of insurance versus what they pay out. And, getting a handle on that type of thing so then we can easily explain it to the normal citizen that's not engaged in that type of industry. And I mean, we had 3 health policy meetings a week for like 3 weeks. And I mean, they threw so much information at us that, it was really tough to digest and try to make an informed decision in such a short period of time. But that's sometimes how the legislative process works. You move things along fast, and that's why you have 2 chambers, because, once it just passes out of the House, it has to go over to the Senate to health policy over there. Then it has to be voted on in the Senate. And if they make any changes, then it has to come back to the House for a concurrence vote. And the bill that you voted out it can be changed so much by the time it gets back. So you could vote yes on it the first time, but then it goes over to the Senate and they do what they do. And then it comes back. It could be a totally different bill that you don't agree with. So then you have to vote no. So to answer your question, basically is I think we just need to have more transparency and make it easier for people to understand what they are paying for and why and where the money is going.
That was a great answer because I think it describes exactly what you go through. I think that was really, really helps people understand. And I also think that we've lived a life with CF in it. We understand clinical trials. We understand so much. So when things like a pandemic hits and COVID and vaccines, and they're going through clinical trials, we understand it. So we're not like scared by it. We understand the process. So it makes it easier for us, but there is a huge educational learning curve, right, that not everyone has. But I also wanted to thank you, Representative Mueller, for being on the Rare Disease Advisory Council that you're co-authoring. That will help anybody in the rare disease community. So your efforts just continue on, and I really appreciate that. And then, Madeline, I just wanted, from your perspective, also, when you see your brother on the floor making this resolution or doing anything for CF or healthcare, you must be very proud.
Absolutely. Amazed by my little brother.
It's wonderful. And I wanted to ask you, because you told me something that I was not aware of. You got vaccinated, got the COVID vaccine, and then tell us why it did not work for you.
We don't actually know, but there's a few theories. So when the vaccines became available, the first question was, will it work in people who are immunosuppressed, solid organ transplantees in particular? So Johns Hopkins designed a study, and they are doing a nationwide. I just went online and registered, and they accepted me into the trial. And they draw blood prior to vaccination to see if you have COVID antibodies. And then you get your shot. And before your second shot, they draw blood again to measure if you had an antibody response. And then they will continue to monitor occasionally to see if you develop antibodies and when. And in my case, I had a Pfizer vaccine, and I got my blood drawn 2 days before my second dose. And it confirmed that I had not developed antibodies to that vaccine. So I don't have any COVID antibodies as a result of my vaccination. They have a lot of theories about it, but they're looking specifically at 2 drugs that are used frequently in transplant recipients, especially lung transplant recipients, that may inhibit that antibody response. And so we weren't surprised. We were hoping to see a better immune response, but we weren't surprised that I think currently fewer than 20% of the participants have developed antibodies as a response to their vaccination. So I'm one of the 80% that currently doesn't have antibodies. We'll do another blood draw soon. I've had my second vaccination and see if that prompted a response. But yeah, it looks like organ transplant recipients like myself are going to be relying on herd immunity to protect us from this particular virus.
And if that doesn't get people to think of others and get their shot, I don't know what will. I mean, when I heard that story, I really thought this needs to be out there so people just understand how important it is for them to be vaccinated. And you think that it's possibly because of the rejection medication that you're on for your transplant that may have caused you not to get those antibodies. Is that correct?
Yes, one of the very plausible theories that they have. So they're going to continue to investigate and hopefully they'll design a study that will definitively say, yeah, this is the drug that's inhibiting it. But, that drug is not optional. Organ rejection is a definite risk. So the risk of COVID is less than the risk of organ rejection.
Mm-hmm. And Representative Mueller, so you have 4 kids, 3 boys, 1 daughter, if I got that correct, you and your wife, Angela. And did you get tested to see if you were a carrier? And did you test the kids?
Well, we're a blended family. So the 2 of the boys are from Angie's previous marriage. Owen and Olivia are from my previous marriage. And before we had kids, my ex-wife and I both got tested, and I was tested younger, and I'm not a carrier at all. I'm not sure quite how that happened, being the second born, but I'm not even a carrier. But cystic fibrosis was also ran in my ex-wife's family and some of her cousins. So we wanted to make sure before we decided to have kids that, the likelihood of them having cystic fibrosis, we didn't want to take a chance because I didn't want to have kids if they would have had to go through what my sister went through. So we got tested, and I can't remember if the kids are carriers or not. I can't remember if we had them tested or not, but eventually they will be because, when they decide to get married, that's something that they should probably share with their spouse beforehand to make sure that they're not carriers, because if they want to have children, that's a decision that they're going to have to make, as a family.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say to other siblings of people who have, a sibling with CF, or parents who are just learning that their child is diagnosed with CF? What kind of words of wisdom do you have for them?
Well, they just have to be patient, and you have to be realistic. So, that's one of the things my sister, I don't know how she does it, having a disease like this that, limits your lifespan, and being upbeat as she is, because I know with a lot of cases, can come depression, anxiety, because of, the fear of death. But, you just, as parents and as siblings, you just have to be patient and understanding of what they're going through. And, we were very fortunate just because of the medical side of it. Our parents had good insurance, but I couldn't imagine, some of these people that don't have the resources that we had growing up, how they would deal with it. So we're really fortunate, but, they just have to take one day at a time and just learn about the disease and just be realistic about it and not try to be fatalistic.
Great advice. And there is children's special health care now for people who are 18 and older that need a secondary insurance. So that's good. I don't even know when that started or if that was around, but that is good for adults now if they need that additional health insurance. Madeline, what are your thoughts on, talking to parents of newly diagnosed people with CF?
Absolutely. I always tell them find the best doctors they can find, do what the doctors tell them to, but make sure they understand why. And I think that's the most important thing. I was fortunate. My pediatricians taught me how to manage my care. When we went to appointments, they talked to me, even when I was 6 and 7 years old, and not my mother. She was there, but they taught me how to communicate and work within the medical field. And that's been a skill that I have relied on my entire life. So get the best medical advice you can find. Do what they tell you to. I mean, the treatments only work if you do it. And in cystic fibrosis, the burden of care is high. I was doing before transplant, and this was for years, 3 or 4 hours a day of vest treatments and nebulizing treatments. But that's why I'm 50. And that's why I was able to put transplant off as long as I could. And so get the best advice, do what they tell you to, but understand why, because the doctors don't know everything. But if you go to an expert and you don't do what they say and the results don't work out, that's always really sad.
And about mental health. So as I said, my daughter's 26 and 23. We started, my youngest, Emily, seeing a therapist when she was probably 6 or 8, because she is focused on the death part of CF. And she's in therapy to this day. Positive, we raise them great, like have no fear, do whatever you want, live life. That therapy has really helped. And Molly, although I think she needs it, hasn't really gone as much as Emily. And I've gone because I'm always worried about their future, their, everything. And then in a pandemic, so did that play an important role for you as well? Both of you, or?
I got lucky again. When I was diagnosed, my mother tells a story. She said, the doctor said, do not go home and look this up in the encyclopedia. There was no Google, thank goodness. They said, you're going to read terrible things. And they said, the reality is we don't know how long your daughter will live, but you better start saving for her college education. And this was 1974. And from other stories I've heard, and I'm very thankful that's what they said. Mm-hmm. But other stories I've heard from people are like, the doctor said the life expectancy is, and people fixate on that. My doctors didn't do that to us. And I'm grateful. So I was aware, because I had friends who were, families we knew where children were dying at 10, 12, 14. And that was going on around, but I never felt, even when I was very, very sick, I never felt like I was going to die. I felt like I was optimistic in the hospital that I'm here, we'll take the drugs, we'll do the therapy, and I'll go home and I'll go back to school. And so I've never fixated on that. I have friends I went to high school with who have died, and I never expected to see my peers die before me. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that every day we're at risk. If you get in your car and you drive down the road, or you cross the street, or there's any number of activities that can come up. And so we're all at risk. I've always taken the plan for the future, because if you don't plan for the future, it's going to be sad. But let's not worry about it, because something else besides cystic fibrosis may become a big threat.
Great attitude. I love that. And it's so helpful that you weren't given that time frame, that you just lived life. That is wonderful.
It makes me so mad when I hear that story. Why would a doctor put a limitation on a child? Unless you're like down to the last little bit, it just isn't relevant.
Right.
Tell parents, plan for that college education. When I hear people in their 30s who haven't set up a retirement account, are you kidding? My first paycheck went in, there was a retirement contribution made, because I've just gone with the assumption that I need to do that.
That's wonderful. And Representative Mueller, is that part of your thought process to enjoy every day? I think it's kind of one of the gifts of CF, actually, is live life, because what else are you going to do, right?
Right. And the thing is because my sister was so active and did things in the way that my mom handled it. Again, we didn't have Google back then, so you couldn't sit around on your cell phone and dwell and look things up like you do now. Everyone self-diagnoses on WebMD. So every time you get something, you always makes the anxiety go up. But the mental health part of it for me. I mean, the same thing was I just never really thought about her having it because she was just so normal. I didn't really think about her dying. As a police officer, I saw so much death.
Right.
As it is, that's where I had to go get counseling. So it wasn't because of her having CF. It was because of all the trauma that I experienced as a police officer.
And I don't know if your parents are still alive now, but if they are, or from whatever point they've seen your success, both of you, they must be so proud.
Our mom passed away a few years ago, but our dad is still around. He's 82, and he was a former legislator as well back in the 70s and 80s. So
runs in the family.
Yeah, he was elected in 1976, which was, fortunate again for my sister with the healthcare aspect of it. So, and that was before there was term limits. So, he did 10 years, so 5 terms. And by the time she was out, she was 16, 17 years old. And she graduated high school younger than normal and went off to Northwestern University and then went off to Colorado to teach, met her husband, and then moved to Minneapolis. So she's always worked. She's always been able to have the stuff that she needs, when it comes to medical insurance. But she's pretty responsible, like she just said, about planning for the future, because she, what are you going to do if you get there if you don't have things set up? So, it's pretty amazing, actually.
It is. And we've only touched on both your stories, but thanks to both of you for joining us in this podcast. Is there anything you wanted to add, Representative Mueller, that maybe we didn't talk about as far as your efforts on behalf of CF or anything about your sister?
Not really. I mean, our stepmother has done it for years now. At our orchard, we have a family orchard and does a car show every year and donates some of the proceeds from that day or from that weekend back to CF. So she's been really involved in that because, again, it's important to her. She's the stepmom, but she's been around for a long time. And, Madeline knows her and actually is really good friends with her brothers and sisters. One of them lives out in Minneapolis. So that's about it.
And that's your family orchard, correct? Is that in Linden? I was looking at your bio, so just want to make sure I have that right.
It's Linden Mailing. It's actually Fenton Township, but it's Linden Mailing.
Gotcha. So that's been in your family for a long time?
Yeah, well, my grandfather bought it in 1941. And that's one of the reasons why my sister is here, because we're figuring out which way we want to take the orchard. And, everything's getting built up around here. We want to keep it going, for us, for, our kids and grandkids and for the community. But we have to transfer from the old to the new, put it that way.
Gotcha. Well,
and she's been a huge help just with her life experiences and everything as well, and her organizational skills and everything to try to help her little brother out a little bit.
What a great big sister you are. That's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. The orchard was a fantastic place. Mueller's Orchard and Cider Mill in Linden. It was a fabulous place to grow up as a kid. And it was only 40 miles north of the University of Michigan Medical Center, which was my second home.
Perfect. And I know we just touched a little bit on your life, and I'm sure you've inspired so many people, but was there anything that you wanted to touch on that maybe would help someone else, that either something you overcame or just your thought process in general as it relates to CF?
Right now, it's just so exciting with the modulators. So when you talk to parents of newly diagnosed children, I just say there's a reason to be optimistic and hopeful and to not worry and plan for the future, because these kids aren't going to have limitations.
It's great. A great way to look at it. Well, thank you both. Madeline Elmhirst, thank you. And thank you, Representative Mike Mueller, for joining us on this podcast. We appreciate everything you're doing for the CF community and rare disease.
Welcome.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.
The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen.
It's not complicated.
Who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know it's got you frustrated, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, check them out online at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's BONNELL Foundation.org. This podcast was sponsored by Vertex Pharmaceutical, the science of possibility, and produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts.